Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me for these fairly regular updates from Washington. I've got 4 items on my agenda that I'll be happy to turn it over to Laura and take your questions. First, and I think we're probably all waiting with some level of bated breath, the president is going to be meeting with the speaker and the other minority leader and majority leader, minority leader of the Senate, the so-called Big Four this afternoon, on what could be an impending crisis. There are some in the House of Representatives who've said they want to hold hostage the United States paying its bills. Remember, this debate about the so-called debt ceiling is really about whether the United States is going to default. The debt ceiling has nothing to do with money that's already been spent. This is the money we've spent. Are we going to actually pay those bills? And the threat that some members are making, that they would just as soon see America default, and the Treasury Secretary has indicated that could happen as early as the beginning of June, is the height of irresponsibility. To have that default would have huge impact on Virginia families. It would send your interest rates soaring. That would affect your mortgage. That would affect your credit card debt. It would affect your student loan debt. It would cost, experts have estimated, about 750,000 jobs. It would send our economy maybe not only into recession, but potentially even worse. And from a geopolitical standpoint, it would be a pure gift to Vladimir Putin, to the Communist Party of China and Xi Jinping, in terms of showing remarkable weakness in America at a critical point in time in the overall geopolitical areas. So I hope cooler heads will prevail and that we can move the debt ceiling, or make sure that we honor and pay our debts. I'm more than anxious to have a debate about the budget and spending and priorities. I'm also happy to have a debate about revenues and how we can make our tax code fairer and actually collect a bit more revenues from those of us who've really benefited from the system. But that ought to be done through the normal appropriations process. So we'll see what comes out of this afternoon. I really hope that we don't have to go through a couple weeks of kind of political standoff here, where the only people that benefit would be our enemies around the world, and it would throw dramatic upheaval into stock markets that are already been very choppy over the first few months of this year. So I'm sure more to come on that topic, but we'll get a little more guidance after the meeting this afternoon. Second, and this is really something I will give you a little headlines on, but we'll do the announcement tomorrow. As chairman of the Intelligence Committee, I think I've communicated in the past with you my concerns about the issues of overclassification of our secrets, the fact that this brutal leak of this airman in Massachusetts, Mr. Teixeira, in terms of how he had access to a number of documents and the potential security leaks and harm he's done to our nation. The question we've had of presidential documents mishandled by potentially President Trump, President Biden, Vice President Pence. So this issue of how we classify, how we declassify, how we handle this whole process has been brewing for some time. It's always been a bit of a secondary issue, but in light of the leak of documents by Airman Teixeira, the potential mishandling by current and former presidents, and just the overall question of how we approach our nation's secrets, I've been working on a major piece of legislation that I'll be announcing tomorrow, bipartisan, that will really take this issue on head on. It will finally centralize who makes the determination of what documents ought to be classified. At this point, each individual agency makes those determinations on their own. There's no overarching theory of the case. Secondly, it would put in place a requirement that you actually have to weigh a public interest test before you classify a document. Right now, the default position is to simply declassify everything because it, frankly, covers a little bit of CYA, as they would say. That problem of overclassification means we've got literally hundreds of millions of documents classified. That drives us to having potentially way too many people requiring security clearances, over 4 million Americans at this point. So too many documents classified, potentially too many people seeing particularly the top secret and beyond documents. And how do we sort that out? Part of it will be having this public interest test. Part of it will be actually putting penalties in place for agencies that overclassify. Part of this will also lay out specific tools on making sure that as a president and vice president leaves their tenure as president or vice president, there is a clearer process on checking documents before those documents end up in people's homes or in their garages, and a more comprehensive approach on how we approach this issue of classification. This problem is not going to go away, but I think the bipartisan legislation that I lay out tomorrow will be start stirring a debate that has been a long time in coming, but we need to frankly fully address. Third issue I wanted to raise, and I think we've probably all seen some of these horrific images as the conflict in Sudan between warring factions brings death and destruction to a country that's critically important, not only in Africa, but on a broader geopolitical basis. And this is particularly challenging because we have the largest Sudanese American population, mostly located in Fairfax and Northern Virginia, of anywhere in the United States. And that Sudanese American population is growing. I've actually got a couple of members of my staff whose heritage are Sudanese American. So I've done two things in conjunction with a number of other senators. One is request the State Department go ahead and extend and recertify that Sudanese individuals here who are trying to come in from that conflict can receive what's called TPS status, temporary protective status. These people who are fleeing the conflict in Sudan, TPS was absolutely set up for exactly this case. They need to be included in that program. Secondly, it's been an outreach to our government and other organizations to urge them in a manner that's as safe as possible to get back in to Sudan to provide that humanitarian relief. We all hope for peace talks that have been going on between these rival government factions to be successful. But in the meantime, there are literally millions of Sudanese who are finding it hard to get basic food and other medical supplies. And as long as we can protect these aid workers, we need to make sure we get that aid back on the ground in Sudan. And the fourth issue I wanted to quickly raise, and this is one that, regardless of where you fall on the student debt relief issue, is something I've been working on for a number of years, that we finally passed the law last year. And what it said is there was a program in the federal government that between like the mid-90s and 2006, at 2006 this program ended. But during that period of time, people that were married consolidate their student debt. So they only had one payment. The problem with that was, what happened if you consolidated your debt, student debt, and then you got divorced? And in many cases, we found spouses that were abusive to their other spouse, and they would be the deadbeat, not pay the bills, and that remaining spouse would be stuck with the combined student debt. Didn't make any sense. We found as well, when you combined your student debt, if two teachers combined their student debt, it, in a sense, restarted their clock on making sure they could get the debt relief that's already part of law, that if you teach, for example, for 10 years. Working on this for a couple of years, we finally got it signed into law. The ability that says if you are one of these joint consolidated loans, and again, the government stopped this program after 2006, realizing it was not working, but there were still tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people that fell into this category. We were giving them relief so that they could get out, in particular, from the abusive spouse, or if they had actually qualified for debt relief because they'd been a teacher or a nurse for the qualified 10 years, they didn't get penalized for that joint consolidation. That was the good news. And we heard from a lot of folks saying, oh my gosh, this is going to change their life. The problem has been the Department of Education has been very slow at laying out the rules and regulations on how you take advantage of something that is the law of the land at this point. I'm happy to report that they put out some of that guidance literally in the last 10 days. I'm going to be working with the Department of Education in webinars and other tools to make sure we get this information out. This is a good news story. It's going to give people relief. It is the law of the land. We just got to keep the pressure on the Department of Education to get the rules and regulations out there so that people can take advantage of this program. So those were the top 4 items, a lot of other things going on, but I know we've got lots of questions. And Laura, why don't I turn it over to you and be happy to take the questions.
Hi, Senator Warner. Down here in Roanoke, there's a lot of people, a lot of readers of the Roanoke Times who are concerned about their mail delivery. And I mean, they're getting mail twice a week, sometimes if they're getting it that much.
Yeah.
I'd just like to read you a message I have from a school teacher here. Her name is Jamie Paw. And she writes, sent you an email about our mail not being delivered for 6 days, 7 if you count Sunday. I stopped the lady in the mail truck on Sunday. She said the mail had not been sorted at the post office on Electric Road near Cave Spring Corner. Told me to contact congressmen and say they were way understaffed. Now, she called John Edwards' office, who's not a congressman, and she didn't get a reply, but you are a congressman. and I'd like to know what you say to people, and I'm hearing from people in Ohio when I write about mail deliveries. What can you tell me what's going on, and why is Louis DeJoy still Postmaster General?
Well, Dan, I read your column, and I am not surprised to hear this program or this problem is perking up in the Roanoke area. I've been living it for the last year and a half in Charlottesville, where this has gotten almost epidemic, and there are a couple things going on right now. One is we actually passed postal reform over a year and a half ago that was to guarantee the 6-day delivery, was to try to give some relief in terms of there was a big pension fund issue that we had to get sorted out, hoping that would give some of the relief that was needed. And I got to tell you, I had real concerns with Mr. DeJoy as Postmaster General. Ironically, and I'm not, I am more open on Mr. DeJoy at this point because we've got a whole new board of visitors, or board of governors on the Postal Service, all put in by this president, and they actually have approved Mr. DeJoy to stay on. And you've got it at the post office, a radical and dramatic change in the basic business model. The amount of mail, and particularly first-class mail that goes through today versus a few years back, has dropped precipitously. And that has changed a dramatic effort in terms of trying to upgrade service, in terms of trying to get new equipment in to make the mail flow smoother. End of the day, though, Dan, the biggest problem has been staffing. And I'm going to get down to Roanoke. I'm going to contact the folks who are the statewide. There's a gentleman I've worked with on Charlottesville repeatedly, and I got to check out the circumstance in Roanoke. But end of the day, we can't hire enough people into the Postal Service and keep them there. When you and I were growing up, Dan, getting a job on the post office was a great career. It was a path to the middle class. That has changed. I know, and I've got a lot more information about Charlottesville than I've got on Roanoke at this point, but I imagine it is the same. Roanoke or Charlottesville was offering about $18 an hour, I believe, as a starting position. Chick-fil-A was offering a higher salary plus a bonus and Sundays off. and generally the ability to get another day off a week. You know, the workforce, we were not paying enough to get them in. Yes, if you get in and stay for, you know, a year, 2 years, and the benefits kick in, it becomes a pretty attractive career option. But keeping people in those first 6 months, year to year and a half, has been a real problem. I know they've held a number of job fairs in Charlottesville. I read in your column that the Roanoke folks were holding these job fairs as well. I know some people are saying this may go back to the problem of a few years back in Roanoke, where they took the central office and actually moved it to Greensboro, so mail that was even going within the Roanoke area had to be routed down to Greensboro and then brought back up. I'm not sure that was the problem, but that was an issue that we saw a few years back. But my gut is, and I got to get the details on this, is that a problem of hiring and retention. And I believe one of the things we pushed in the Charlottesville area was to call this a hard to staff area and see if we could bump up that opening salary. I'll try to make the same appeal in the Roanoke area, and we will we will get at it. The challenge has been, unless we can somewhat dramatically increase the starting salaries, it's tough to get people into the Postal Service and stay. Once they stay for a while and they get the benefits and they kick in, we've still got a lot of folks that do great work there. I don't know if this is the case in Roanoke, but a lot of even the folks who complained didn't take it out on their carriers. They knew their carriers were working their tails off, but if their carriers got sick or if they were on vacation, they didn't have enough personnel to fill in, and that led to this delay. The question of not even getting sorted at the main post office or the post office in Roanoke, I will get on that, and I'll get my office on that right away. But as I think you're seeing from the case of even folks coming from Ohio, this is not a Charlottesville specific or Roanoke specific problem. This is a problem system-wide. And when you've got the decline, particularly in first-class mail drop-off, it really means the whole business model has to be reworked.
Senator, our next question will be Drew Wilder with NBC.
Go ahead, Dan. Let him have one more follow. Go ahead, Dan, if you want to make a quick follow.
Sorry. Why don't postal workers get benefits when they first start their job?
They do get benefits kicking in. Matter of fact, the benefits, they've dramatically advanced the benefits in terms of the vesting period. Like in any job, you get benefits from where you start. But the more attractive benefits that people used to get, and they thought, getting that job at the post office, benefits kick in. It used to be, like in any job, before you get your full benefits package, you had to vest, sometimes up to a couple years. We have actually lowered the vesting time dramatically, and I'll have my office get to you, Dan, directly. I do think they are doing everything possible to compete, but when you're in Charlottesville in particular, it was more difficult. I think the same will be the case in Roanoke, where you got a pretty healthy local economy. You just don't have young people saying they want to go make a career in the post office. So we're going to have to, and I hear stories again where, you've got 20 companies coming and doing a job fair, and you may have 500 people coming by, and 2 or 3 people are the total number that even stop at the post office recruitment center. So we're going to have to sweeten the offer to get people into the Postal Service. We're going to have to, I think, look at pay and benefits to make sure we just stay competitive. And this is a change because, again, the business model of the Postal Service, even 5 years ago versus today, is dramatically different. And again, Dan, I thought a couple years back, I blamed a lot of this on DeJoy. I'm not sure that is the place to place the blame anymore. I think the overall grade he's gotten, again, from a totally new board, has been that he actually has a business model in place that is slowly turning this battleship around. But if we lose faith of people, and they've got in the stories that you are hearing, and I'm afraid they're not just unique to Roanoke, if we lose people's faith in the Postal Service, all that's going to do is drive people to use it less and make make the business model even tougher to crack.
Gotcha.
Senator, we're going to move
Thank
on to Drew Wilder with NBC4.
Okay.
Hey, Senator, thank you so much for taking the questions. Last week, the FBI arrested a Northern Virginia man, lived in Springfield, actually, and he was charged for being an ISIS sympathizer, providing material support, and attempting to provide material support to a designated foreign terrorist organization. I just wanted to ask kind of broadly, your position in intelligence and so on, what is the current status, the health of ISIS as a terrorist organization? What is, if any, the existing threat to national security, specifically from ISIS?
Well, the good news is that we don't hear about ISIS as much because the capabilities of ISIS have been dramatically degraded. This has come about from both our efforts and efforts of our allies in the Middle East. If we think back, what was it, 3 or 4 years ago, where you saw the so-called ISIS caliphate controlled a wide swath of Syria in particular, and even bordered into Iraq. That caliphate has been extinguished, combined between Turkish efforts, Kurdish efforts, Iraqi efforts, our efforts behind the scenes. Most of the leadership of ISIS has been is actually captured and in prisons in Syria. A lot of that is due, candidly, to the efforts of the American intelligence community. And even though for example, we don't have the same presence we used to have in Afghanistan, we still have what's called ISR. We still have capabilities to monitor terrorist groups. But even though we don't hear about them as much, there are still many who wish us harm from that part of the world. And they have sympathizers, again, not nearly as many, but some sympathizers, and I don't know the particulars on this case. I would imagine that this individual was discovered through one of the tools that is up for renewal this year. It's called Section 702, that allows our intelligence community to look at for example, phone or other communications of foreigners outside the United States. But if that foreigner happens to be in contact with a person in the United States, we can trace that back if there is a national security. There still is a series of checks that go into this process. And again, not knowing specifics about this case, but having been briefed a little bit about on the front end just from the public news, I think this is a good news story that the threat of ISIS is down. There are still some remnants, and we still have to be on guard. And it's one of the reasons why this debate that we'll have later this year about the next 5-year renewal of what's called Section 702 is terribly important, not only in terms of our ability to go after potential terrorists who wish us ill, but also to go after challenges we see from the Russian spy services and the Chinese spy services, who are also active in trying to do us harm in a variety of ways.
Senator, our next question will be Mitchell Miller with WTOP.
Hi, Senator. Thanks for joining us. I wanted to go back to the debt issue and ask you kind of a more general question going forward. As somebody who's been through a lot of these battles over the years, do you have an opinion on a different way to go about this? Do you think that there should be some type of unilateral situation for the White House, or going to the 14th Amendment? There's been talk about minting a coin. And then also there's been talk about, bringing back some of the so-called super committees that were used in the past. I just wonder if you think there's a better way to run a railroad with regard to these type of issues.
Mitchell, you're like old enough to remember, my first gang up here was the so-called Gang of Six when we were debating this in the 2011-2012 timeframe, where we took the recommendations of the Simpson-Bowles Commission. At that point, American debt was at about $16 trillion. Now we're at close to 32 trillion, and the Simpson-Bowles Commission took on all three components. It took on how do you reform our entitlement programs, Social Security and Medicare, to make sure they're going to last the next 50 years. It said, how do we put a limit on some of the spending so that we're more fiscally prudent? And it also said, if you're going to look at those, you got to look at the revenues. And unfortunately, we didn't get it done at that point. We actually had broad bipartisan support, and the leadership of both political parties at that point didn't even give us a vote. And then we had years of abnormally low interest rates, and this debt and deficit issue seemed to be, neither political party had any credibility. Republicans would cut taxes like mad, Democrats would raise spending, and everybody kind of buried their head in the sand. So do we need to do something about it? Absolutely. Do we need to use the full faith and credit of the United States and put it in jeopardy? That is stupidity on steroids. And anyone that advances that notion is irresponsible and frankly doesn't belong in any position of responsibility, because to put in jeopardy that full faith and credit, to say the United States of America is going to default on its debts, is beyond the pale. And that would lead, as I said, to chaos in the markets. If you got a 401k plan, nothing would be worse in terms of your retirement. If you got a mortgage, if you got a credit card debt, you'd see them soar. If you got a job, many, many jobs would be in jeopardy, as that whole economy would be jolted. So we shouldn't be using that tool. And frankly, part of this, I blame us Democrats, because we raised it 3 times under President Trump, where the very same people who were complaining about the debt ceiling didn't complain at all. And President Trump did as much to increase the debt as anyone, and in many ways, in a necessary way, when we had to spend so much on COVID. We should have gotten rid of that political hand grenade. And I should calm down on this one, but we should have gotten rid of that political hand grenade at that point in time. No other nation in the world has this kind of political hand grenade at their disposal, because it's about whether we're going to pay the bills we've already incurred. Whether we've gone out and taken the benefit, put it on the credit card. Are we going to pay the bill? We should get rid of this. Now, what do we do to deal with the overall debt issue? We can have a debate. I actually have joined with Mitt Romney, I think a pretty fiscally responsible Republican, and said we ought to try again on one of these super committees or one of these outside efforts where we had a BRAC type process where you get an up or down vote, and you can't cherry pick which areas. The absurdity of what the House passed, they've said we're not going to touch defense, they're not going to touch Social Security and Medicare, they're not going to touch any kind of revenues, and then they've said they're going to cut 22% across the board everywhere else, but then they said they're going to maybe exclude veterans or some of these other areas. It is a laughable, absurd plan. It is nothing but a political document. So let's have a fulsome debate on this. And if there is a way we can do it through a commission that will force hard choices, and then you got to vote up or down, I think that makes some sense. But we're not going to be able to solve the debt issue without dealing with revenues, without dealing with discretionary spending, and without dealing with, I believe, some reforms to our entitlements to make sure that they're going to still be there 50 years from now. The absurdity of what passed in the House is they didn't touch entitlements, they didn't touch revenues, and they didn't even touch, what's called mandatory spending, which includes those programs. They touched less than a third of the budget, and they took all of the cuts out of that portion. That is not a serious approach.
Senator, our next question is Michael Pope with Virginia Public Radio.
Senator, thank you for taking my question. I'm wondering if you had any reaction to current Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin saying that efforts to pursue equity have gone off the rails, that what might have been admirable 10 years ago, efforts on DEI, equity, also ESG in the financial sector to take a look at environmental social governance, the DEI programs, ESG programs have gone off the rails. I'm wondering, Senator, do you have any reaction to the governor's comment?
Well, let me give you my views. I think for example, on ESG, that responsible investors want to know what the climate change risks might be to businesses they invest in. Because I can tell you, the United States military wants to know, because I know we have to spend literally hundreds of millions of dollars a year raising the docks, in many cases, down our Norfolk Naval Base, because the science and the facts of that rising sea level is an issue that has to be addressed. And the idea that you're going to restrict investors from having that factor of climate change factored in as something that's reportable so that you can make good business investments makes total amount of sense. The idea, and the Trump head of the Securities and Exchange Commission, Jay Clayton, acknowledged that that companies want to know and investors want to know, how companies treat their workforce. Businesses today, about 50 years ago, businesses had about 75% of their assets were tangible assets, plant and equipment. Today, it's about 80% are intellectual capital and the human beings that make up that business. Businesses want to know how a company treats their human capital. That falls into the ESG category. And Jay Clayton under Trump acknowledged that and said that ought to be something that ought to be reported. I think we ought to respond to what the market wants. I think as well, and as somebody who, again, working with the Trump administration, I am, and Secretary Mnuchin, in one of the COVID packages, obtained $12 billion to go into community development financial institutions, CDFIs, and minority deposit institutions, because we found that we were losing because the traditional programs were not supporting black and brown-owned businesses. And we were losing a lot of those businesses. The Trump administration saw the value of making sure there was access to capital was going to be on a fairer basis. Anyone that denies that Virginia history, that we got to be telling the good and the bad and the ugly of Virginia's history, including the enormous stain on our history around massive resistance, where Virginia schools shut down public schools rather than integrate, and somehow that would not have had an effect on people that lost those years of education, I think is doesn't acknowledge the reality of what happened, for example, in Prince Edward County, where under my term as governor, in a bipartisan fashion, we put in place state support for basic scholarships to those black Virginians who had lost part of their schooling due to massive resistance. And I think it's just, I still can claim I've been a business guy longer than a politician. Virginia at this point is approaching 35% people of color, black, Latino, AAPI. If that 35% of Virginians are not fully participating, if they're not getting the same educational opportunities, if they're not starting businesses at the same rate as the balance of Virginia, if they don't have fair access to capital, then the enterprise we know as the Commonwealth of Virginia is not going to maximize its returns. It's not going to have the kind of attraction to people from around the country and around the world that we want Virginia to be. So I believe that reflecting Virginia's diversity and making sure it's fully inclusive and making sure it's fair, yeah, I think there are moral reasons for that, but I think there are plain old business 101 reasons. And I will match my business credentials against any elected official, current or former, on making the case that in a Commonwealth that's 35% diverse, we ought to make sure all of those Virginians are getting a fair shake and the fair shot that I had, and that makes good business sense for Virginia.
Senator, our next question will be Mike Gooding with 13 News Now.
Hi, Senator. Just a quick follow-up to Mitchell's question 2 questions ago. The debt bill that passed in the House last week doesn't specifically target the VA. That is true, but it doesn't explicitly exempt the VA either. Yet, Republicans such as Jen Kiggins are now criticizing and blasting OMB and VA for calculating that it could result in a 22% cut to the VA and a loss of 81,000 jobs and reduction of 30 million primary care appointments. And so they argue that that's playing politics just by producing that math. What do you make of that criticism?
Well, what I say is it's basic math. You make these kind of absurd cuts and then somehow wave a magic wand and say, but don't worry, it's not going to hurt your program. It's not going to hurt your interest. That's the worst of Washington speak. The truth is, if people are going to say they're going to exempt the VA, does that mean they're going to then cut air traffic controllers by 50 or 60%? Or does that mean they're then going to cut the folks who inspect our poultry and our meat and our food by 75%? Or does that mean they're going to suddenly cut not 22% out of the Border Patrol that we want to keep our borders safe, but we're going to have to cut 60%? You can't have it both ways. You can't make these kind of ridiculous level cuts without any explanation and then say, oh, I didn't mean that program. The math doesn't work. This was a political document, and the fact that the irony is that even the House leadership said there were a whole lot of things in terms of implementing some of these cuts that would happen overnight that they said 4 days before the vote that they would never do, that they did because you've got this extremist group on the far right who are basically saying if you don't do everything we want, they're going to throw the speaker out. And the irony is as well, and I hope this is one of the things that come up this afternoon, is, the speaker keeps saying, negotiate. I hope he'll say where he is willing to negotiate, because there's been more than 10 Republicans. I'm not saying the congresswoman from Virginia Beach, but there have been a heck lot more than 10 Republicans who've said this, political document they put forward was their floor, not their ceiling. So if he retreats from any of it, they'll vote against it. I hope at the end of the day, and I think the only way something's going to pass is a reasonable group of Republicans and Democrats in the House will come together and do something rational, the same way that that we've done that in the Senate each time, where bipartisan groups came together on a series of bills over the last couple of years, or bipartisan groups came together in raising the debt ceiling 3 times under President Trump. I hope that same kind of rational approach will take place in the House, and I hope as many of the Virginia delegation as possible is part of that rational group. But I have no sympathy for anyone that says, I'm going to vote for this crazy document, and then say when any program comes up that they want to protect, oh, we didn't mean that program.
Senator, our next question will be Barbara Sierra with WTKR.
Good afternoon, Senator. Thank you for taking our questions this afternoon. My question is along the lines of 2 other questioners, but I want to put a fine point on this particular inquiry. What is the worst case economic scenario for the Hampton Roads region, given its heavy military, government contractors, and military retiree population, should the government default?
Should the government default? Sailors don't get paid. Retirees don't get their Social Security checks. People go to get their Medicare and get turned away because the government's not paying its bills. And you say, well, oh, no, we're going to prioritize this or that. The truth is the first priority is paying the interest. And that's just a normal, if you have a normal, and I'm saying this would be bankruptcy, but if you have a normal bankruptcy, debtors get first take before any other programmatic activities take place. And if you think about government as a business, and we'd be in uncharted territory. But probably there'd be very few regions in the country that would be harder hit than Hampton Roads because we have so many veterans, because we have so much military presence, because the federal government is such a large investor in the region. There would be plenty of, I can't think of a region that it would be crazier for to have a default than Hampton Roads. And anyone that's not recognizing the reality of that either can't read a balance sheet, doesn't understand how government operates, or is somehow thinking magic dust is going to come upon and things are just going to go on as normal. As someone who lived through the downgrade back in 2011 in 2012 when we just got close, or as someone who saw when I was governor and we were almost losing our AAA bond rating, but we found that coalition of responsible Republicans and Democrats that saved Virginia's AAA bond rating, and we got named best managed state because we did what was hard and we did our job. I know some people may not have been active at that point in time, but I can tell you the damage done would be draconian. And the thing that I just would appeal to folks is that the notion of these rating agencies, and the rating agencies evaluate your debt, and if you get downgraded, your cost of your interest go up. So that means interest rates for mortgages, everything is tied off of the T-bills, would all go up. And the thing with the rating agencies is that you don't have to actually default before they downgrade your rating, because even getting close puts fear in investors. And once you downgrade, they won't come back and then say, oh, it was just we got close. It takes years to regain that confidence. It was one of the reasons I fought so hard back as governor not to have our AAA bond rating downgraded, because I can tell you a lot of other states would give their left and right arm to get a AAA bond rating, and when they got downgraded, even if they got their fiscal house in order, it would take years to recover that. This happens in America, it would take years to recover.
Senator, our next question will be Danielle Sandler with WVNS.
Hi, good afternoon, Senator.
Hey.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I would just like to know more about the Joint Consolidation Loan Separation Act, how it benefits debt relief.
Well, what it does is that it takes this group of individuals who had student debt between the early 90s and 2006. And it was people who got married and decided that they would consolidate their debt, student debt, into a single payment. That made sense if you stayed married. Didn't even make sense if you stayed married on some cases, because it also made the time of when you count your 10 years, if you're a teacher, for example, to get public student debt relief, it messed up with the clock there. It was such a problem that in 2006, the government said, we're not going to allow this joint consolidation to go forward. But you had this universe of people, tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands, because you've got those student debt that was government guaranteed debt and private student debt. It's now been estimated it's literally in the hundreds of thousands of people. And what would happen is somebody gets divorced, and particularly if you've got a spouse that was abusing you. There was a lady that got divorced from her husband in Texas. She moved to Northern Virginia. He was an abusive spouse. She had nothing to do with him. She was still trying to raise her kid, and because he was a deadbeat and didn't pay his student debt, she was responsible still for the total student debt. That's not fair. That's not right. We passed a law to make it able so that if you were in those, you can, in effect, finally file to get your debt split back up. The problem has been the Federal Department of Education has been slow on getting out the rules on how you go through that process. Now, for many people, because there's been a pause on student debt due to COVID, that has not meant immediate harm, But when that pause is taken off, a lot of these folks are going to be going back into the circumstance where in some cases they're paying off hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt from their former spouse who they have nothing to do with. And that's horribly unfair. The problem has been getting DOE to put out the rules. Literally in the last week, they've set the first level of guidelines down. I'm going to go out and work with them on webinars and other ways to make this universe of people that are in this circumstance understand that we've got a law that now should protect them, give them the right to basically unburden themselves from that former spouse and just pay the debt that they owe, not their spouse's debt. And then for a smaller subset, those people, I had two folks actually from Kentucky that were both teachers. They both had taught more than 10 years, but because the way they consolidated, they didn't get credit. It's hard enough to keep teachers teaching. We ought to continue this program that after they've taught 10 years, they get some forgiveness of student debt. This law, it's not a bill, it's now a law, will help them as well.
Senator, we have time for one more question with Amy Knowles, the Virginia Dogwood.
Hey, Senator Warner, thanks for taking our questions.
Thank you, Amy.
It's Teacher Appreciation this week. So I wondered if you would share a story of a teacher who had a positive impact on your life.
Well, it was Mrs. Adams in 4th grade, and she kind of got me interested in government and history. And then I moved around. I was living in Indiana at that point. In 8th grade, there was a woman named June Tyler who was my social studies teacher, and she probably put in me that notion that government could actually be an agent of good, and that we got the government that we deserved, and that we needed good people to try to serve. And so Mrs. Adams in 4th grade and June Tyler, my 8th grade social studies teacher, were two incredible teachers that really helped shape my life. And I know even though you guys are even members of the press and sometimes jaded, I bet each and every one of you have got a teacher's story as well.
Senator, that was our final question.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, everybody. Be good.